Hello and welcome along to the latest episode of the RacingNews365.com Formula One podcast. My name is Michael Butterworth and I'm joined as usual by Dieter Rencken, editorial director of Racing News 365. And this week, Dieter and I are very pleased to be joined once again by Cedric Selzer, former chief mechanic to Jim Clark in his championship winning year of 1963. Cedric, welcome back to the show. We had you on briefly to discuss the British Grand Prix a few weeks ago, and it's fantastic to have you back with us today.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, I thought today we'd go and have a little bit of a look back through the pages of history, because as I mentioned in the intro there, you were chief mechanic to Jim Clark in 1963. That's a fascinating era of Formula One. So many fantastic drivers, so many innovations that were pioneered in those early 1960s. How did you end up working at Team Lotus?
Well, actually, it was a matter of luck, really. As you know, I came from South Africa. And at the end of 1960, there were a series of Grand Prix in inverted commas, and Sterling Moss was there, and I befriended him, and I said, that I'd like to come and work in motor racing in England. So he gave me a letter to BRP, the British Racing Partnership, who are up in Highgate in London. So I came to England, went up to Highgate, and they said, terribly sorry, but we haven't got any vacancies. And so I then took myself off to another team that was run by Reg Parnell in Hounslow, and it was the same answer. But I got a job with a Formula Junior team, which was not very exciting, but still, it was on the way up. And I was with them for probably about 4 or 5 weeks, and they actually sacked me because they thought I was incompetent. But I took myself down to Monte Carlo for the Grand Prix. I was actually fortunate in that way that my mother was staying in Nice with friends, and she just bought a new Lancia. So I had the use of a car, and you could drive into Monte Carlo in those days. And I went and watched the Grand Prix, and then I just wandered onto the circuit, round to the pits, and I said, where does everybody drink? And they said, the Tip Top Bar. So I took myself off that evening and said, I'm looking for a job. And Lotus was short of one person. And I spoke to Jim White, who was the chief mechanic, and he said, yeah, come next month and we'll put you on a month's trial. So that's how I ended up in Lotus. I wasn't exactly the chief mechanic. That's sort of, it didn't actually work like that. There was a chief mechanic, but it ended up that one person looked after one car. So I actually looked after Jimmy Clark's car. And how that happened, the first year in 61, I worked with a chap by the name of David Lazenby, who was well known, and he showed me all the ropes. And then in 62, I looked after Trevor Taylor's car. And in 63, the team was split, and we had a choice of Indianapolis or Formula One. And I thought, I didn't really want to be stuck in America for weeks on end, because I also had a social life here in London. And Colin Chapman said to me, would you like to look after Jimmy Clark's car next year? This was the end of 62. And I said, yes, I'd love to. And that's how I ended up by looking after his car. But we only had 5 people on the team. We had an overall chief mechanic, and then the individuals who looked after the cars. And we had 4 people on our team, plus a gearbox mechanic, and I think a few more in Indianapolis. And how it worked was, well, we had 3 cars, a spare car, is that you looked after your car, and when it came to the night before the Grand Prix, which was always an all-nighter, we had to double up because the actual lists we had were just miles long, and you had to prep, the car yourself. And that's how I ended up by looking after Jimmy Clark's car. And of course, we won 7 out of 10 Grand Prix. That was for World Championship events. And we had 1 second, and that was due to a faulty spark plug from new. I blame myself for that. I should have checked all the plugs prior. In other words, when we were practicing, I should have taken a new set of plugs and tried them in the car, but I didn't. And then we had a faulty battery in America. We had those white Varley batteries, which were absolutely useless. I often wonder how aircraft ever flew with them, but there you are. And then, of course, in Monaco, we had gearbox failure.
You mentioned Colin Chapman there. What sort of a man was he like to work for?
Unbelievable. He was such a driving force. It was so exciting. And he also gave you leeway. You could interpret things your own way. He encouraged this. You could interpret things your own way. So it ended up that there were no two cars absolutely identical, because everybody had a different interpretation of what a Formula One car ought to look like and perform like. So, he encouraged that. And also he could see the ability in you, which you couldn't see yourself. I remember on one occasion we'd done two all-nighters in a row, and we were completely exhausted, and he just walked into the workshop, and just his presence, he lifted everybody up.
Cedric, we've known each other for many, many years, and it really is a great pleasure to have you here on the Racing News 365 podcast. So thank you once again. But you say that Colin Chapman, gave you leeway and whatever, but I seem to remember you telling me as well that a couple of times you got fired by him and taken back a couple of days later again, and so on and so forth. Just run us through that sort of dynamic, please.
You're right. Okay. Well, that was actually par for the course with Colin Chapman. The first time we went out to South Africa for a series of 4 races, there were only 2 of us, the 2 cars, and then they decided they were going to cut back because they couldn't afford us. And I was the last in. I was the first out. But in the meantime, there was a court case going on, so I was acting as a lawyer at the same time. So as the chief mechanic in Jamendra said he didn't need me anymore. And when Colin Chapman heard about it, he said, "No, I want him back." So that was the first time. The second time was at Alton Park. I was looking after Trevor Taylor's car, which was a tubular space frame, a Lotus 24. And we didn't get the engine back until 7 o'clock in the evening. And we had to put it in the car, track the car up, and drive up to Alton Park to be there for first practice, which only 2 of us, which was an awful lot of work. What happened was the engine ran its bearings, and I got blamed for it because I hadn't cleaned the tubes out of the Lotus 24, the oil tubes. At any rate, Colin Chapman said, "Get out of my sight. I don't ever want to see you again." So I caught a train home, and then Trevor Taylor drove Jimmy's car that he was going to race in Monza the next week, which was a Lotus 25, a monocoque, and it pulled the radius arms out of the monocoque. So you can imagine what would have happened at the banking, I dare and think. At any rate, the engine went back to Climax, and Climax found that they had fitted the wrong bearings. That's the reason why it ran the bearings. So I was absolved of that, and I was sort of taken back. And after that, I was the blue-eyed boy because I'd saved a serious accident at Monza. And in fact, a few weeks later, I said to Colin Chapman, what happened at Alton Park was a blessing in disguise. And I remember what he said was, "Don't I know it?" So that's why. So I only sacked twice. I know people have been sacked 3 times and re-employed.
Cedric, you spoke about the races, the 4 races in South Africa. You spoke about the Alton Park race. These, of course, were non-championship races.
Yeah.
For Formula One, yes, but they didn't count towards the World Championship, of which there were 10 that year. How many races did you do in total? I mean, you did races all over the place. When we spoke, and you spoke about a race in Austria and all sorts of places. How many did you do during the year?
I would think it's somewhere between 25 and 30 races a year, but they all counted for sort of income. That was the main thing, that the teams needed the money and they needed their parents' money.
There was, of course, no sponsorship back then. Therefore, basically the team's income was either the trade income from the tire companies or whatever. Alternately, it was the prize money. So
and the start money.
Start money, yes. Well, all part and parcel of that sort of promoter fee, which is what you got. Now, when you did all these races, I mean, it's all very well for people to say, but it wasn't a Grand Prix, but the car still has to be prepared to the same level.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was no difference. One was for a championship and one wasn't, but there was the same level of input. As I said, it was identical.
Well, obviously, Cedric, you were the chief mechanic for Jim Clark in '63 when he won the title. When you first started working with him, could you tell immediately just how good a driver he was?
We all knew it. I mean, the writing was on the wall in '61. Unfortunately, there was a conflict between Innes Island, who was the number 1 driver, and he expected to be the number 1 driver in 1962, but he was sacked. He was in the way, to be honestly truthful, and Colin Chapman pushed him out of the team because all focus was going to be on Jim Clark.
So when you worked with Jim, I mean, you worked with very, very many drivers over the years. You spoke about Innes Island, you spoke about Trevor Taylor, you spoke about Jim Clark, but you also worked with other drivers in your subsequent career. What made Jim Clark so special?
He just had an absolute natural ability, and the very few drivers who I consider had a similar ability. Obviously, people like Senna had. But he didn't know himself why he was that quick. But I was talking to Sterling Moss about him one day, and he said to me, Jimmy had that very, very light touch. And Jimmy was very good at actually setting a car up into a corner. But there were other problems with him. I mean, he was so good. If there was a problem, he would drive round the problem. Then it was difficult to ascertain what the actual problem was because he drove round it. But that at the end of the day, but between the car and him, you just had the best equipment and the best driver in the world at the time.
We're sitting here in your office, Cedric, surrounded by photos. I think there must be about 50 photos here. Most of them with you and Jim Clark in them, and he's always smiling. Was he really a sort of personable, friendly person?
He was an introvert, and he had his close friends. He was very difficult to talk to, apart from motor racing, and he wasn't a social animal at all. But I get asked this question: "What was he like? What was he like?" And I always say he was bloody quick.
He was very attached to his farm as well in the Scottish borders, wasn't he? On his gravestone, it says farmer before it says racing driver.
Yes. I mean, he loved farming. I've been up to the farm a few times. It's changed completely, but from a sheep farm, and they now grow oats and things like that, and animal feed. But the farmhouse is exactly the same. Actually, there was a story about a ghost there. Trevor Taylor told me about this, and I asked Jimmy, and he said, "Yeah, he's actually seen her." So that is an interesting concept.
Well, obviously, the car that he was driving in '63, that was the Lotus 25. Now, when we had you on the show before, You said that this car was the biggest single innovation in Formula One history. What was it about the 25 that made it so revolutionary and so different from anything that had come before?
I think the main difference was the torsional stiffness of the car. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but its predecessor was about 800 foot-pounds per degree, which was nothing at all. And the 25 went up to about 3,000 or 4,000 foot-pounds per degree. And obviously, well, as in modern racing cars, you need a very stiff chassis so you can set the suspension up. And that was the main difference with the car. It wasn't that much lighter, actually, but it was easier to actually tune, because if you altered something, it would actually make a difference. On the 24, you would alter something and it wouldn't really make a difference.
And yet the 24 won races as well, Cedric.
Yeah.
So it was a competitive car by the standards of the day.
Yeah.
But the monocoque, I think, also made racing a lot safer because the driver was sort of enclosed by a sheet of aluminium rather than space frame tubing.
Yeah.
But tell us about the safety standards of the day. I mean, compared to today.
Well, there were very little. I mean, if you look at the regulations, it said it had to have a crash hoop, but most of the crash hoops were below the level of the helmet of the driver. No seat belts. You had to have a fire extinguisher, but it didn't specify the size. And everybody put a there was one called a Bradex, which was I'm just trying to think about the size of a mug of tea, and we had them in the car, but that's all. And apart from the strength of the car that Dieter mentioned, Trevor Taylor had quite a few accidents and was barely unhurt, and serious accidents. So they were a lot safer, the 25s, as compared to the previous cars.
You shared with me once the 1963 regulations, and I remember the one clause which said seat belts shall be optional, but must be worn if fitted. But Cedric, moving on a bit here, you're talking about the number of people on the team. Could you just explain exactly what sort of duties, how many people for the 2 or 3 car team, and what their duties were, please, compared to today, where a team has got 50, 60 people?
Right. Well, if you looked after the car, like I looked after Jimmy Clark's car, which was called R4, it was your responsibility entirely, the whole car. We had 3 cars normally at a meeting, the one spare, and a gearbox mechanic, and then a spare mechanic on top of that. And as I mentioned earlier, that all 3 cars were actually looked after in practice. Occasionally, the 3rd car was rented out. So we were then under pressure because we couldn't double up entirely. I remember in Monaco, we lent the spare car to Dan Gurney because his car hadn't arrived. And Brabham was under contract to Esso, and so were we. So there was something. So we were really under pressure because we were one mechanic less. So but we muddled through and we got everything done.
I think we should just add in there that Dan Gurney was the driver in the Brabham team, but his car didn't arrive, and because of potential fuel company contracts, it was crucial that Gurney had a car, and because we were both Esso contracted, he got a Lotus. So equivalent, in fact, to today, somebody moving from, I don't know, from Williams across to Red Bull because they've got the same oil company, which is unthinkable nowadays, but that's the way it was then.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talked about there's just a few members of the team. Obviously, it's nothing like it is today. You're traveling around all the way through Europe, sometimes all the way to the other side of the world. What was that travel environment like in the early 60s?
Well, we actually drove the transporters ourselves. We only had one transporter. We could put 3 cars in. You had to drive them. We took it in turns. We did 2-hour stints When we went to America, of course, the cars were flown and other companies transported the cars about. As regards money, we were given £2.50 a day for expenses, and this had to cover your hotel and food. Now, I mean, you can't even buy a half a pint of beer for that now. But we came out. Sometimes you lost, and sometimes you made. So we were quite happy with that. And there was always a few pence over for entertainment in the evening.
Cedric, you were basically on a wage per week, and then you were also on a sort of a bonus thing. And I think you said to me one day that, regardless whether it's a world championship race or a non-championship race, first prize was always about £750.
Yeah. Now, I think in the non-championships it was a bit less, but there was start money, which I never knew how much that was. But for the World Championship, first prize was £750. We got 10% of that, which was divided up. And that was also divided up in 63 and 64 with the Indy team, and they divided their prize money. They didn't get 10%, I'm sure, with us. So it evened out. But as a bonus for winning the World Champion in 63, we each got a Cortina GT as a present, which was very nice. Actually, it started off as a Mini, and Ford Motor Company heard about it, and they went out in arms. They said, no, they've got to have Fords. So we ended up with a Cortina GT.
Which were actually given to you. They weren't on loan.
No, they were our cars. And that was an extra prize for winning the World Championship.
Cedric, going back to the life on the road, so to speak, you drove the truck, you got to the other end, you offloaded everything, you prepared the garage, the pits, the whatever, you tended the car, you prepared the car, you packed up afterwards, you drove to the next race or back to base. I mean, how many days were you away from home, given the fact that you did about 30 Grand Prix in a year, or Formula One races in a year?
If we went to the continent, if there was practice on the Friday and Saturday, we would arrive on Thursday night. So we would leave on the Wednesday. And then we'd come back on the Monday. And of course, then there was a mad panic to actually get the engines out. Although we were dog tired, as soon as we got the engines out, we could go home and have a couple of days off. But obviously, on a longer trip to America and Mexico, we were away for a few weeks, probably about 3 weeks in total.
If you went to Enna in Sicily, for example, that would have been more than a day's drive there.
It would have been, yeah. It took a couple of days there and a couple of days back.
And in terms of the life on the road, I mean, it was you and how many mechanics in the truck?
Well, all five of us were in the truck. But if we did a non-championship race, we would take the smaller transporter, and there were just two of us looking after two cars. So, you had to deal with carnets and things like that, which you were expected to do. So it wasn't that difficult, but you had to learn very, very quickly.
At some stages in the recent past, I've taken you into some of the Formula One teams where you sat in the back or stood in the back of a garage and observed the proceedings. Just tell us about your observations.
Right. Well, it's obviously the thing, the whole world's changed with the advent of computers. My first impression is, I said, if I was young with the same mentality as I've got, I could never work in this environment, because I like making decisions. And as I said earlier on, we were encouraged to. And just to be part of a mega team wouldn't have suited me in any way, at all. The other thing is that I don't even know, but I wrote a book, and the book was called "If You Come Second, You've Lost." I mean, I see euphoria if people come second, a team comes second or third. We were so disappointed, I mean, we were so mentally geared up. We just had to win. It was the most important thing. And the effort we all put in to actually winning a race was incredible. A lot of hard work. And it also affected me in different ways, especially when I looked after Jimmy Clark's car. When we won, when we did, as I said, there was wow. And then I would wander off on my own because I wanted that winning experience. I didn't want to share it with anybody else. And then after about 5 minutes, I'd come back. And funny enough, that after that 5 minutes, with everybody else in the team, we all focused on the next race because this race was finished. It was the next one that counted. And that's how we were, and that's how we lived. And very close proximity, so we all had to get on very well together.
And one of the points you make there is that, it was the next race. So we sort of have that mentality today, which is, after the race is before the race.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think, the Formula One mentality has always been go, go, go and do whatever you can. But of course, the fundamental difference was that you carried far greater individual responsibilities in your workings with the driver, preparing the car and whatever else. When you prepared your car, I mean, you not only, the way I understand it, you not only prepared it, but you also built the car initially.
Yeah. Team Lotus actually built the first monocoque. Dick Scammon, who ran Cosworth, he was in the RAF for a while, and he knew about riveting and God knows what else. So we had his skills to actually start with. And then later on, the monocoques were built in the paddle shop at Lotus, but that's all we had was a bare monocoque. Then we had to build the cars ourselves. And this is what I say, that you interpreted the way that things were fitted into the car. But a lot of the things were reverse engineered. In other words, we actually manufactured the parts ourselves, and then the drawing office came down and drew them.
So you're saying if you did, say, the pedal boxes or the front wishbones, suspension wishbones or something, you would make them fit based on a rough blueprint, and once you had made it, they would then come along and adapt the drawing.
Yeah, no, it was mainly sort of brackets for auxiliary items like electronic stuff. There was no drawing for them, so you made it fit the car, and then the drawing officers came down and drew it.
Cedric, you spoke about your book. First of all, obviously, if any of our readers, listeners are interested in a copy of the book, Cedric still does have some. They're actually reprints. The first issue was sold out straight away, but there are copies available. We could actually put Cedric's emails for order purposes on the website. We'll publish it so that any readers interested in buying the book can do so. I've read it. It's very, very good. It provides a fantastic insight into 60s motor racing. I mean, let's not forget, we're now talking about an era 60 years ago at a time when the Formula One World Championship was about 10 years old. It's now 70 years old. So there's been enormous change over the time. And this book really does provide this sort of contrast where people can fully understand exactly where Formula One came from to where it is today.
Well, Cedric, just quickly, I know you're still a keen student of Formula One. When you go to a Grand Prix today, do you feel the same buzz as you felt in the early 60s?
I think I look at it as a different. I'm a spectator, and I'm not involved. I love racing cars more than I love motor racing, if you can understand where I'm coming from. I just think they're the most exciting beasts in the world.
Well, Cedric, I feel like we could listen to you for hours, but we're coming to the end of the podcast now. I've absolutely loved hearing about all those amazing stories from the early 60s. Fascinating time for Grand Prix racing. And thank you so much for sharing them with us and appearing on the podcast once again.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
And the RacingNews365.com Formula One podcast will return to its regular schedule from next week as the 2022 F1 season resumes after its summer break with the Belgian Grand Prix on August the 28th. That's it for this edition of the show. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back after Spa.